2 podcast with David Holmgren. He's the co-originator of permaculture. Zoning, I can see it, the good demonstration of zoning in permaculture in Meliadora.
Yeah, well, the idea that the intensive food gardens should be close to the kitchen door, so to speak, so you can quickly get things and bring them inside, and also the awareness, especially for modern people, even who are quite outdoors, if something is further away from the house, we don't pay it as much attention.
Yes.
And
it's
I
more
know
common
that
sense, I think, logically.
Yeah. Now it's interesting, I suppose, when for our forebears in the past, living in very, very tiny houses, maybe with no light and no running water, and people might go and work in their fields that might be some distance, that was a very different work pattern. But the efficiency of having food gardens close around a house is very, very special, and especially for modern people who are more sort of house-centered. And so it's also the sense that we can create a more benign, cultivated living ecology, which is like outdoor rooms of the house. That's what a garden, the inner zones of a garden should be, an extension of the living zone. And so all of that management and manipulation where we're pruning things and trainings in particular ways to modify the microclimate, all of that attention to detail works so much best when we're there with it. Whereas the things that are further afield, large crops, grazing areas for animals, and especially forest and resources that work more by themselves, need to be further afield. And that idea in permaculture design for a particular farm or a small rural property originally came from a study by geographers in Germany, on the plains of Germany, where they noticed this pattern around the dense pattern of small village, quite compact urban settlement. There would be the initial gardens and horticultural crops, and then there would be the field crops, and then the pasture, and then there was forest. And that this pattern existed around each village. And we took that and said, maybe that applies to a greenfields site design for an individual property in the Australian rural context. And so something that, it was part of a village design pattern in a particular part of the world, we took up, and recognizing that in different places, those ideas need to be adapted and changed to suit circumstances. But a lot of it is around how to optimize one's own human energy, which is its greatest power, close to where you are most of the time.
I think now it's very much needed indeed, the need of the hour, conserving the human energy, because we don't have that much energy to do that much of a big effort because of health conditions also. I think it's more logical. It's very interesting that how you took it when you read the village landscape and then remarkably add it into permaculture so that modern people can. It makes a lot of sense to focus on the things more efficiently rather than overwhelming, I need to manage the forest, I need to manage the animals, I need to manage this. But based on the priority, where it needs care, good intervals, I think. Good.
It was also part of what Mollison said when people said, where do I start? What do I do? And he would say, start at the back doorstep of your house where it goes out into the garden. Start there, where you have the most control, the most familiarity, rather than sort of trying to think of maybe things that are overwhelming for people. especially
Yes,
in
yes. That's a
processes.
big blunder I have made. I should admit or accept in front of the media. I did a huge plantation, 7 acres at once. So now I'm really overwhelming. Oh, how do you manage? Start small, permaculture principle. That's my best buddy right now.
Yeah.
So you can mimic that once you're comfortable with your mistakes, and that is much, much easier. And I wanted to go over the details about retro suburbia. It impacted a lot of urban people. And there is a great movement going on in India too, that is a roof garden right now. So I think it is similar, retro suburbia. Could you brief a
Yeah.
little bit about for the audience?
Yeah, well, recognizing that the world is changing very fast and
Yes.
things are opportunities to have grand schemes to create eco-cities and all sorts of ideas on a large scale, that in a way those are sort of like 100-year projects.
Yes. Yes.
And so that in many ways humans everywhere are facing the environmental crisis and very rapidly changed world with whatever is around them. And certainly building stock, even in the modern world with rapidly growing economies, it takes sort of decades to change and build new building stock. So the sense of retrofitting what already exists as a strategic opportunity, especially I saw that from the perspective of Australia and other long affluent countries where that most people were living and have lived in urban areas, in spite of the reputation of Australia as being a rural place. In 1900, Australia was the most urbanised country in the world, actually. We had the highest proportion of urban residents. But the special, I suppose, role of the suburb of detached houses on small parcels of land was originally seen as a sweet point, having the benefits of the city and the benefits of the country. And of course, in modern Australia and the United States, there's been a whole lineage of urban planning, which has seen it's ended up with the worst of both, the worst of the countryside and the worst of the city. But from a permaculture retrofitting point of view, we saw huge opportunities for incremental, small-scale adaptation and change, where people have some of the freedom and autonomy that we associate with rural properties, and yet there is some critical mass of community and possible connection for sort of informal community organisation, for childhood networks to develop without dependence on parents, with many opportunities, because there is a reasonable density of people together. And that without the more complex technical and regulatory and cultural difficulties, if we say we want to change high density cities, because there's so many more stakeholders when we're talking about high density buildings, they're more technically complex. The retrofitting for different futures is actually not impossible, but more complex and difficult. And it needs a greater proportion of society seeing the necessity for that change before you can make much start. Whereas in the suburban scale, people can make a start on their own place and connect with other like-minded people in the street or the neighbourhood. So we did write Retro Suburbia unashamedly for Australian context and even the southeast of the continent in a sort of cool, temperate and Mediterranean climate. Instead of doing the book publishing thing where you've got to make it, this is a general book for the whole world type of thing. But we felt that people, certainly in other long affluent countries with the suburban pattern, most powerfully the United States and Canada and New Zealand, and to an extent Britain, that people would make the adaptations and interpretations. But we're even finding in places like Latin America and India, people are saying, oh, we can interpret some of these ideas to apply to what might be quite different contexts.
Especially weather, I think that is the one which is different, but the patterns might be same. But the lands you choose and the seasons are a little bit different. So that's where you have to be careful about it.
Yeah. And obviously things like, the passive solar design that's so important in our climate in the tropics where the sun is mostly overhead. There's different building patterns, and we sort of intimated some of those things, but recognizing that at the suburban scale, when people develop really good solutions, often, there's another house that those same design solutions can apply
about was passive solar design. The idea that houses can largely heat and cool themselves in southern Australian climates without the use of much in the way of augmented heating and no mechanical cooling. Building with natural materials was also, for me, a given. So mud brick as a material, very little in the way of embodied energy, great thermal mass, not such good insulation, but a great structure to hold up the roof. And the other was, of course, timber and my passion for trees, sustainable forestry. So designing the house around those materials with passive solar design, and to minimise the use of electricity, certainly no use in heating or water heating. And also to build in wood as the secondary form of energy for cooking, for hot water and backup space heating.
It was really good in terms of having a wood stove that gave me the possibility of learning how to use the wood that we had locally and that we could gather ourselves. And I found that a very lovely family process to go out and collect wood a couple of times a year. Another feature of the kitchen was the cool cupboard instead of a big refrigerator.
The cool cupboard draws air from underneath the house in contact with the ground, which then rises by convection up the column of the cupboard. And so it's a very simple technology. It's not a fridge, but it means it's much more suitable for storage of many things. And so we just have a small underbench fridge, and that's been adequate for us all these years.
So that possibility of replication and extension by just simply copying something, whereas sometimes when you copy something from a completely different environment, it almost never works. But so that suburban pattern of similar houses of a similar era in the same landscapes creates whole templates where it's possible to copy what neighbours or others did, and it works. Can work.
Thinking pattern also will change, I think.
Because most people like to. What's that?
Thinking pattern also changes when you look at other people and about good ideas, obviously.
Yeah.
So how you can think differently and adapt to your environment, how we can take that good positive change. Then it will be easier for you to find out with your climate and other situations.
We also saw a lot of opportunities for complementary development at the suburban scale along a street, and ideas like, the conflict with children needing to play ball games and rough games in limited space gardens, and that being incompatible with delicate vegetable and food gardens, and that one person has got the big shady trees and the trampoline and the play space, and the other house next door has the extensive vegetable garden with the very keen gardener, and they're swapping something that, the children are playing here, but then the food is growing here. So those different complementary skill sets or priorities or different sites suiting different things can develop, if you like, a complementary informal gift economy between those places.
Yeah, that's a good way to put in, actually. Yeah, that's a good term, complementary economy.
We saw that in terms of ideas like, if not taking the fences down between properties, gateways, pathways between, so people start making use of space in a more efficient, designed way. And I suppose the aspects of really rebuilding the household and community non-monetary economy at the same time as providing a lot of opportunities for children to experiment with different things that might start off as a passion or a hobby and become a small business, things that they can try, that there needs to be a lot of diversity in the household and the community environment, so children can learn by that immersion and see different things that they might take up. So in that way, it's sort of like the suburban scale is often a nursery for new actual livelihoods and businesses that might then actually become part of the monetary economy in time. So I think that environment for raising children with the diverse opportunities
is very important at this point of time, changing the environment for the kids to have that freedom of thinking and exposure to diversity rather than just one idea, just go to school and get a degree. There's a very best environment.
I don't know how much it's a problem in different places in India, but in Australia and other long affluent countries, there's been this retreat of ranging territory over which children used to travel. And when I was a child, being able to travel many kilometres free with other children and just needing to come back home at night, whereas progressively each generation it's been analysed how the ranging territory has become more and more constricted, and not just with higher density urban development, but even in these lower density environments, and how to enable a reclaiming of territory for children to sort of occupy their neighbourhood. And we see that perhaps in some other countries that process hasn't degenerated so far, and children are still a bit more free, but we think that important to reconstruct that belief that that's possible, even if there are all sorts of fears and risks.
Yeah, in India, I think cities still it's restricted, but villages to some extent, villages are also transforming, but it is okay in villages still, a little bit. But in cities, it's the same story, like any other city in the world.
Yeah.
But now they're going into the retreats and weekend vacations so that we can get good exposure to nature and have a fresh breeze, and that is the culture coming up. I think it will be changing slowly. Like me, a lot of people transform from corporate job to just completely doing permaculture or just farming or different lifestyle with the nature. So it is change is inevitable and it's coming. It's minor. I wanted to know about the Friars Forest Eco Community that you built.
Yeah.
Just briefly.
Well, in the mid-90s, I was approached as a consultancy job about assessing this piece of land for a potential eco-village, and I had an assessment of the land and then made a very rash response at the end of the day's consultancy by saying, "Don't worry about the consultancy fee, I am interested." And that was the beginning of a process by which we became partners with another couple in developing the 120 hectares that led to a hamlet of 11 residential lots clustered in one part of what's a very rugged and diverse, mostly forested landscape in central Victoria. And it was our partner's intention that they would be the first people living there. That didn't actually sort of work out. Sue and I were very much committed here in Meliadora and our wider community. So we never committed to that we would own there, but that we would live there. But we owned one of the residential lots and we developed that with other people. So we are very much involved in the community, but from a distance. And I suppose it reflects a lot of the situations of people living in rural Australia with incomes from other sources and some of them commuting and that sort of thing. But there is an element of husbandry and management of the forest. Which is quite unusual in our sort of cultural and economic context, that most people don't bother to manage forests or ideologically think the forest should not be touched because because of past damage and the idea of forest husbandry is still a relatively foreign idea in Australia. So I'm very proud that the community there all sort of see that in a positive way. So we often call ourselves greenies with chainsaws. So we are environmentalists, but we are also thinning and managing the forest for better health in the longer term. And there is quite strong elements of keyline water design in the development of that property, of using the larger patterns of the landscape to harvest water, using contour roadways feeding around to large earth dams, which beautify the environment and make it more fire safe in the fire-prone landscapes that we have in this part of the world. And there's many different ecological houses of all different natural building materials have been built there over the years.
It's a lot of things combined into one huge area. So that's a good framework for that community. And I got a few questions from the audience, from the subscribers. So I wanted to read from their perspective. The first one, youth wants to graduate, wants to start, they're inspired by permaculture, but social responsibility or social pressure they might have. So they wanted to start in this path. So what do you advise for the youth, just a student, let's say, for example? That's one of the questions.
Yes, well, it's always very difficult to know. Yes. Context is everything. As we say, the answer to every question in permaculture is it depends.
Yes.
But yes. I think as a young person, it is always good to be able to allocate time to travel and learn through immersion in all sorts of different opportunities where one can work as a volunteer, even if it's in quite simple, apparent menial tasks like weeding or feeding animals, or all of the different practical activities. And through that process, see what you can learn, what you like, what you decide is, oh no, that's not what I'm attracted to. And that opportunity to become a useful person, useful to yourself, useful to other people, is a huge opportunity and a low cost opportunity. And even when some of the learnings are negative, that those are temporary things, that you immerse yourself in the context, in the experience, and then go, oh, well, we've learned something not to do here, or something to avoid, or find where our passion is. And I think that's been a very strong way in which permaculture has spread. I would say it's almost as important as the permaculture design course has been. People just going to different permaculture inspired properties or related places, and they might not be all rural, they might be in urban areas too, because it's looking at how people and experiencing living in a particular way, rather than it just being an idea in the head.
Practical knowledge is very, very important in this field, especially because you'll have one idea and it's fascinating, but practically, are you fit for it mentally, physically? Is it really a good idea? It sticks with you for a long time, or just a fascination? So I did really learned when I did a PDC course with you, and really fortunate to come to Australia and do a PDC with you. There's a little story to it also, how I ended up in Australia. Because there is Aranya alternatives, I think, in India. They are permaculture pioneers, work with Bill Mollison. And they rejected me for their course. I signed up for a course, not PDC, but other course. They rejected because I don't have a PDC certificate. So I thought, by the time I have already implemented some of the permaculture principles and worked with the schools and sustainability living, a center profile, they rejected. Oh, you know what? Okay, why not? This is a good opportunity for me to learn. Anyway, I want to visit Australia and work with the co-originator himself, learn from him. So that's, thankful to Aranya. So that is a very good, intake for the youngsters, especially good advice to immerse with the idea and get the knowledge, and then think about you are really serious about that part of it. Any plans to visit India? We would love to host you for sure.
No, my traveling is much more modest these days, and I am trying to actually focus more to see a lot of things locally in our region. It's ironic that when we are often so focused here at Maliadora and at Friars Forest and in the projects that we're very directly involved in, and then the outreach to the world, whether it's things like this podcast with you or writings, that sometimes the ordinary things within our bioregion, of which there are so many interesting ones, and I feel also a responsibility to acknowledge and see what people are doing, and both to continue to learn from that, but also to use my status as the co-originator to say to people, good on what you are doing. This is significant. Keep going with that. That is, I don't know anyone else who's doing that. So that sense of giving back into my bioregional community has been a stronger sense of responsibility that makes me
Yeah.
able to consider travel. But yeah, who knows?
Yeah, another subscriber was asking, he has around 100 acres of land and he has done PDC and he's overwhelmed with idea of converting the entire land into permaculture design. So how much, is worried about little bit, how much money I need, how much manual labor, and this looks like overwhelming. So that's his state of mind.
Well, I think the first thing is to look at what is the current management of the land, or what is the past management, and what are the opportunities to have some sort of caretaker management that keeps options open, and yet is not particularly degrading the land or creating very strong problems that might involve lack of social license or legal license. All of those factors that who knows what those things are, especially for me thinking about those things from Australia. Because it's very important not to look at land as a blank slate, and to also, I suppose, what I said in the Reading Landscape film about understanding the land as deeply as possible, of what's there and what the history has been and what are the processes at work, and trying to understand those things, not in a judgmental sense of initially of what's good and bad, but just try to understand processes at work. And they're both the wild processes, the natural processes, and the human activity that there's been. And that may be quite hidden or in the background in land that might have been relatively unused or abandoned. It might be right through to there's actually already someone with some license or lease to use the land that's about to come to an end. And so all of those possibilities, I think the understanding as much as possible and being able to be on the land in some small way that, again, that depends whether there is some sort of residence or whether there's some sort of opportunity to reside or be somewhere where basic domestic needs can be more or less met rather than just visiting a place. And so you can experience the land through different possibilities. But I mean, I used to say when I was doing consultancy that when people buy a piece of land beyond, say, the size of Meliadora, then one's own physical labour is a small part of what is needed. Once you get to something like 100 acres of land or so, it's the other processes, which are primarily animals and machines and money or resources in some way, that must be mustered together to be able to make substantial changes from what the land has been. Because there's a good reason that farmers often use the land as it was, because there wasn't necessarily a big pool of capital to do something radically different. They might have just done things because that's what they've always done with the land. So often people are looking at land that is being passed field crop land or pasture land, or in some cases wild forest land, and wanting to create some sort of horticultural food systems, and that's a step up in intensity. So especially if that is considered on the larger scale, there's a huge step change, and no matter whether it's done with permaculture methods or conventional methods, it involves a lot more resources in infrastructure, in plant stock, in all sorts of things.
Management also.
But there's also the possibility of saying, can there be some sort of caretaker land use, like sensible grazing of animals that might just require some fencing or some water sources to maintain the land and hopefully be worked in a way that improves soil, but basically works with the natural seasons and the rainfall. And then maybe there's a small place which is a residence, which is some sort of small garden farm that is a starting point. So between those, start at the back doorstep. Often, if there is no back doorstep, you have to have that sense of, where should the back doorstep be? Where should a person be on this land? So it can be taken from many different perspectives, and I don't think in a permaculture design process there can ever be a single recipe for that process. But hopefully some of those things I said, connect with the possible situation.
Reading the landscape is a very good thing, David. So what is the film you are mentioning?
So this is called Reading the Landscape with David Holmgren, and it was a film that can be accessed through the readinglandscape.org website. It will be freely available. Initially, it's through a sort of subscription there of putting in your email address, because it's still going out to film festivals. It's just been in the Melbourne Documentary Film Festival, and it's me at all different sites, places around central Victoria in Djadjurrung country, reading the landscape from rural properties to suburban scale, and other people, including Woody, who we were talking about earlier, and other colleagues, including a local Indigenous woman. So it's more inspirational than didactic or instructive, as is inevitable with reading landscape. But
I'll add that link in the description about your website and all the other details, and they might subscribe and they get the newsletters, and they get to experience your work even more and get inspiration, of course, and to do more for the earth. I wanted to ask you, Reading the Landscape, about it, but I think they can take a look at that movie and going through your website, and that will be more insightful, rather.
And it gives quite a strong sense of Meliadora and its evolution too.
So what is my last important message for the future generations from you? Wanted to conclude with this.
What I was saying before about immersing oneself in doing things and contributing for young people is an opportunity to become a useful person to oneself and to others. And through that, what you take away is more valuable, what you have within than whatever you contribute in a volunteer way. But I think also another message that's important in all the messages about the collapse of nature and that everything that humans touch being destroyed, I think there is the counter message that partly comes through the Reading Landscape film nature's resilience and her ability to reconstruct fertility and abundance, given half a chance. And sometimes even when humans aren't just not constantly damaging it. So we see that a lot with the work we have done around what's called novel ecosystems and understanding how nature is constantly constructing new forms of life. And so rather than the chaos of nature falling apart, which is the prevailing message we hear all the time, and I know those messages are important and there is a lot of truth in them, but I think to be able to see whether it's the small plant growing in the cracks in the pavement or animals readapting to changed environments and new environments, how quickly nature learns through changing animal behavior, sometimes to our annoyance, sometimes in ways that put us back in the fighting nature position. But to have that sense of nature as strong, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think you made it a simple way that when I asked you about the permaculture, that producing and consuming, these two are very important, I think, in everyone's life. If we can fix those, what are we producing, either through our actions or through our emotions? What are we emitting with our actions? At the same time, what are we consuming? So what kind of things we are entertaining in the name of a consumer?
Yeah.
So these two things are very much important. So there's
and bringing those things back together.
Yes.
Whereas the economy has pulled those things apart and taken them away from one another, so they don't speak to one another.
Yes,
Production and consumption. Whereas
yeah.
In the extreme, when we garden and eat food from the garden, we're in the economic jargon sense, we're disintermediating this huge chain of separation and bringing that back together. And in many different ways, we need to bring those two processes together so they talk to one another.
Yeah. And we see the relationship with one another rather than disintegrating. And I don't waste food anymore because I have realized after doing the farming of growing paddy how difficult it is. So wasting one grain of rice is also, how much I can see this work. So that's how you realize also that's like self-transformation happens when you really at least plant a tree or plant something and do something with one single part. I think that will change for people's perspective, for themselves and for the earth and for the planet. So this is the way I wanted to conclude. And I really, really appreciate David, and it's a good in-depth knowledge of about the permaculture concept itself and other things, and how one person can leave an impact in the world. You are the true testimony for that. And of course, joining in our podcast is a really big blessing for me. Thank you very much.
I will
say hi to
best
Sue
of luck
and
with
other team.
your projects. And I think what sustains me is all of the people around the world in their own ways, small and large, doing things with permaculture, of something we started that has spread and is alive and transforming in its own way, with all of the different creativity and thinking and fusion with other kindred ideas around the world.
Yeah. That's a good start you guys have started, and really appreciate Bill Mollison's work also in this podcast, since he has done a major work in